Good evening to all of you that dare to leave your desks during midterm week. Thank you for being here. We're here for the lecture of Gretchen Wilkins. I find it interesting that industrial buildings are designed to a necessary degree. Their appearance is often straightforward, earnest, and most important of all, non-exclusive. They often present a mix of formal languages borrowed from mechanical, rural, and urban aesthetic. They are underestimated as anonymous. And this is one of the reasons industrial aesthetic remains, in most cases, independent from predominant or fashionable stylistic movements. Nevertheless, they also own a strong identity that imposes itself, and Walter Gropius would call this the unintentional beauty of industrial buildings. These are buildings for tools, for manufacturing, and for labor, rather than in habitation. Gretchen Wilkins' work focuses on how such industrial buildings influenced, or better said in her PhD final dissertation, manufactured and urbanism. Her research looks at how manufacturing industries, in particular automotive industry, are silent protagonists of the shape of the cities as we know them today. And in particular, she studies how such architecture has been able to influence what we know as current urbanism with its formal and social rules. On one hand, one could argue that her work flirts with a long tradition of utopians who believe that technology and material networks are fundamental to the economy of a city, and that the architecture of labor and production are propeller of society, a concept that has been spanning from the ideal city of Ledoux to the General Motors Futurama pavilions. But a closer look to her work would reveal that her research is highly influenced by the fate of the post-industrial city of Detroit and the dystopian aftermath of what one is left with once the technological and economical propeller of a city has run its course. Tonight's lecture, Unfinished City, will revolve around such research and will focus on the integration of productive industries in cities, looking at how new formal and economic models might, in the future, challenge, one more time, our notion of architecture and mobility. Just a few brief facts. Gretchen Wilkins has been practicing and teaching architecture for nearly 20 years. She is based now in Michigan, and she's been based before in Australia and Vietnam. I'm looking forward to this Saigon pictures. She's the head of the architecture department at Cranbrook Academy, and prior to this new appointment, she started, I think, in fall 2018, and she's already going to all the meetings for recruitment, and so we see each other quite often, I think. She was an associate professor of architecture at RMIT at the Vietnam campus, and before then in Melbourne. Please join me in welcoming Gretchen to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you. Oh, yeah. It's in the presentation mode. Do I just do forward? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be at SCI-Arc. I actually haven't been to this building before, so I feel very close to SCI-Arc though, because we have a lot when I was at the University of Michigan teaching there, we had several faculty from SCI-Arc, either as alumni or people that were teaching previously at SCI-Arc, now at Michigan, so it's really nice to be here. And I think there is a lot of sort of overlap in a way of where I am now, Cranbrook Academy, the program there and its ambition and spirit, and what SCI-Arc aspires to be. So it's great to visit. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk a little bit first about cities. Detroit, especially, as Elena mentioned, I spent about 10 years at the University of Michigan, but a lot of that time I was based in Ann Arbor, but looking at the city of Detroit and running workshops and doing projects with collaborators in Detroit. And then I went overseas for about 10 years. I went to RMIT in Melbourne and Vietnam, and I've just come back for a position at Cranbrook. So a lot of the work that I do, and also in teaching, has a lot to do with cities, with manufacturing, with thinking about how we make cities, how we make in cities, how we make from cities, and how that affects, what the city is like, the urbanism that results. So I'll talk a little bit about that first, some observations and things I've been thinking about, and then I'll show some projects that I've worked on that relate to those ideas or try to get at them in some way, and at some scale. So when I first got to Michigan and to the Detroit area, was 97. Right after that, in 98, this happened. I don't know if any of you are from Detroit maybe, or know this building. It's the Hudson's department store in downtown Detroit. And it was imploded in a really highly sort of theatrical and ceremonious way by the mayor. The mayor pushed the button to implode the building. It was covered by television. It was live. People were there watching. Because at the time, Detroit, as you know, was a city that, without going into the full history, we probably all know it, but it was one of the most successful, largest cities of the U.S. at its time, maybe in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then started to decline quite rapidly, lost half of its population in 50 years, and at the time that I arrived had been in pretty dire straits for quite some time, which you'll see in a minute. So this was, interestingly, more of that destruction and more of that erasure of the building stock, but done so in a way that was meant to be a rebirth, the Detroit Renaissance. The Hudson building was really important as an icon for this sort of Renaissance because it was, even before the automobile industry was the economic engine of the city, really the Hudson's was like a sort of cultural and commercial hub for the downtown. It was just a massive building. It sponsored and still does actually, even though it's not there physically anymore, but it's the Thanksgiving Day parade. It would just attract all sorts of people from everywhere around to create this kind of street life and event around Hudson's. It was like the center of attention for all of that. This is, though, what that site looked like, Woodward Avenue, in 10 years after that implosion. So this I took right before I left. It was pretty bleak. And I think the idea that the city was going to revive itself at that time, say in 1998, was maybe just a bit premature, but the site itself wasn't ready for that. The city itself wasn't yet ready for that. It was still suffering a kind of economic decline. And then, of course, in 2008, as did many cities, it was impossible to come back quickly after that. So the site itself stood like this as an abandoned, demolished site for about 20 years. It was an underground parking garage, and then just was an open lot. Until very recently, a developer in Detroit called Bedrock, which is owned by Dan Gilbert, who is the owner of Quicken Loans, came to Detroit maybe 8 or 9 years ago with Quicken Loans and has invested billions in the city for redevelopment. But he was in the news recently more controversially because of this ad, which is, he's trying to revive the city, bring businesses there. He's invested heavily. The Bedrock owns about over 100 buildings in the center, the CBD of Detroit, which is not that big of a CBD. So they basically, at this point, own the city. And they're trying to revive it through that redevelopment, through programming. But this ad in particular drew a lot of, reinforced some of the skepticism that people have about this kind of development, which is that, Detroit doesn't look like this. I mean, demographically speaking, racially speaking, it's 82% black from the last census. It's filled with all sorts of minority groups. There's Greek town, Pole town, Mexican town, Little Italy, a huge Middle Eastern population in Dearborn. So the fear is that this rebirth of the city that is now finally happening is going to look like this. It's going to look like every other city, or it's at least going to completely erase the difference that was there and replace it with something that's very homogeneous. And this is sort of at the root of the questions that I've been asking is how do you prevent that? How do you find a way architecturally through the work that we do to resist that sort of broad brush stroke of development where everything gets agglomerated by large developments, smaller parcels start to get eaten away, there's less accessibility, there's less difference. How do you resist the typical wave of momentum when that wave is quite successful, where in fact what we need is a lot of investment and capital to get things off the ground? So it's a really tricky question. This is what the Hudson's building site is proposed to be. This is by Shop Architects. So Shop has been commissioned to do the new rebuild of the former Hudson's department store site. And this is so they're working with Bedrock, and this is the proposal for that building. And this is the proposal for what that street life would then look like, which is obviously a far cry from what this looked like. So it's a really, I suppose, for me, the interesting question is this cycle of the city. And in the case of Detroit, it's so palpable. It's so evident. It's so physically evident. It's very rare that you see a city transform itself from a sort of highly successful, bustling, vibrant city to the image that I just showed, to then this in the space of 60 years or more. So how that death and life and rebirth of a city happens is something that I've started to see in some of the other places that I've been living and I've been looking at in terms of urban questions. The next one, obviously, being Melbourne, which you would think is a very far cry from Detroit. It's won the world's most livable city award for the last 7 years. It didn't get it this year. It got Vienna got it this year, and Vienna was always second. Melbourne and Vienna vying for the same role, and I think that's a really interesting moment for reasons that I'll describe in a minute. But Melbourne is obviously in Australia. They call it the design city. It has quite a lot of investment in design, really highly supportive of the arts. I moved there in 2008, so the global financial crisis almost didn't, you just didn't feel it in Melbourne. In Australia generally, there was so much other investment internationally, particularly with China, that it was sort of protected from some of the crises that happened in cities in the US and globally. So in that time, actually, is when it had started winning the world's most livable city award, which a lot of us that lived there and looked at the city were like, this is impossible because there's a backside to this kind of very spectacular success of the front side that either doesn't get measured by those same metrics or people just aren't looking at. I was reminded of, some of you may have read this book, The City in the City by China Miéville, where there's two cities that are occupying the same exact physical space. It's a sci-fi story. And citizens of one city or the other, they're in the same city, but you have to sort of unsee the other city, one being more positive, one being more negative. And it's like that. It's like there are two cities in the city of Melbourne that are the same city, but you just don't have to occupy the same space in some ways. And for me, it's interesting because it's, in comparison to Detroit, it's on this incredible upswing in terms of construction. So there's about 40 new high tower skyscrapers under construction in the past 2 years, currently still under construction. There was a study that came out recently, about 2 years ago, that was worried about the rapidity of the construction, how dense the city is going to become, where it compared it to Hong Kong. There's certain blocks in Melbourne that are more dense than Hong Kong. There's no quality regulations of housing, so that's a real scare because a lot of these are apartments, say with windows in the bedrooms, or there's just nothing regulating the quality of the interior spaces, and it's going up so quickly. So in the midst of all of that excitement of building and construction and success and livability, this is what it looks like. It is a beautiful city, there's no doubt. It is incredibly livable place on the one hand. This is the Yarra River, and on the right, you can see there's a cultural district, there's a casino, there's several, like the Melbourne Cricket Ground, the Rod Laver Arena, where the Australian Open happens, Federation Square, which is like the heart of the city, is a museum complex. all of that's happening right along this river. But on one side of the river, I think it's an interesting study. On one side of the river, this is the casino, the Kuran Casino. It has every hour, every evening, these giant gas fireballs explode, which are called the gas brigades. And it's a touristic attraction. It's nice in the winter, I suppose. It creates heat, but it's incredibly expensive. There have been statistics that every time this goes off, it uses as much fuel as an average home does in a year. That over the course of a season, it costs, or maybe it's a week, it costs $20,000 in natural gas. So it's just, I mean, it's in front of a casino. The whole point of that form of entertainment is exorbitant spending, right? Spending money for the sake of recreation, which is a really extreme thing when on the other side, directly on the other side of the river, which is on the city side, the CBD side, there's a really increasing homeless problem. This is in front of Flinders Street Station, but it's all along this river, where you can see that elevated rail line is where there's a really difficult homeless problem. So the homeless rate has increased over 15% in the past 3 years. So again, this kind of flip side, the twin cities of the front side of the success of a city, and then the back side. And I think it's interesting that it didn't get the world's most livable city this year, possibly because some of these metrics are playing into it. Unaffordability is a real problem, clearly, as is congestion and mobility and all the same things that start to plague cities, that they have to sort of somehow reconcile these two things coming together. So the third city then that I've been spending a lot of time in that I think plays into this narrative, all of these cities being in some ways at different phases of what you might say is a kind of continuum or a phase of development of cities, probably generally, is Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. So I was teaching architecture at RMIT in Melbourne. We have a campus in Ho Chi Minh City, also in Hanoi, but the bigger one in Ho Chi Minh City. And I went over to Vietnam to set up a master's program. And so I spent a little over 2 years living in Ho Chi Minh City. This is generally what the city looks like, for those of you who haven't been there. I mean, it's a very, very dense, but very small scale density city. So the typical building type is what they call a tube house. So it's these very narrow, sometimes 2.5 meters or 3 or 4 meters by 10 meters by 5 or 6 levels. All of that actually was originated because of French colonial planning laws or regulations where the residents were taxed based on their width of frontage on the street. So you got this very fine grain, almost like in Detroit actually, where you saw development along the river, or typically along rivers, really, really narrow lots that go quite deep. That's what the general fabric of Saigon looks like. This will just give you, I'll let this run as I talk, this will just give you perhaps a sense of it taken from the back of a motorbike taxi, which is generally how people get around or how I would get to work some days that it didn't rain. But you can see the sort of fabric of the city with these very narrow tube houses. Often the front ground level is a shop front, a typical sort of shop house arrangement, but the entire city is so predicated on continual movement. Like nothing ever stands still. Everything is this kind of flow of people, of goods, of interactions. It's sort of dizzying how much movement there constantly is in the city. So as well as a kind of density of, like a physical density of the building stock, there's also this density, like a quality of density that's about the vibrancy of the city, the interactions, the intensity, the close proximity of everything happening kind of all in one spot. And I think that kind of movement is embedded in, it's really sort of embedded in the way the city works. It's such a level, it's such a cultural level that if you replace that or you block it or you somehow get in the way of that, then the city just stops functioning, and that's what's happening now. So the city, Ho Chi Minh City is on this kind of beginning track of development. It's an emerging economy, it's a developing city, but it's developing really quickly. And a lot of that development, at least in the south, in Ho Chi Minh City as opposed to Hanoi, is about erasing the fine-grained building stock and putting in much larger footprint building stock, which when you see some of the detail of how things work and how the small interactions, the small movements, how that all works, it actually just completely falls apart and comes to a stop when you just dramatically kind of erase that and replace it with something else. So I've been looking at Ho Chi Minh City very much in terms of the physicality of it and some of these details of like how it works the way it does, why it works the way it does. Everything can happen from some form of mobility, from typically a motorbike. The storefronts are all facing and accessible from the street, or the street life is all, you can drive up pretty much anywhere. This is on every Sunday at the Opera House. There's free concerts outside in the early morning, and people drive up on the motorbike, and that just becomes seating, and then when you're ready to leave, you can just pull out. All of the curbs, all of the steps are made into ramps so that you can literally drive anywhere, and it's like this kind of flow of water that just seeps into the city, as opposed to main arterials like say we have in Los Angeles. The inside of these very narrow tube houses are what's called hems, which are just laneways or little back alleyways that are sort of by default a bit private because of the scale, just simply because you can't fit back there. And you wouldn't go back there unless you sort of knew what was there or you lived there. So you can wander in, it is public space, but the scale of where it goes from the outside block to the inside block gets so small and narrow that it just naturally becomes a bit more private. It naturally just becomes part of the space of the people that are living around there. And then within the tiny hems, you also have making spaces. So people making garments, or people making tools, or people fixing bikes. So, and this gets back to my interest in spaces of making and manufacturing. In Vietnam, I became quite interested in that because it just happens in the same building fabric of the city as kind of anywhere. There's not a separate zoned area for manufacturing goes here and food service goes here. It's all quite integrated because the scale of the spaces allows it, and because there's a density to support it. It's incredibly efficient, I suppose. I don't know how healthy this is, but spaces are used for making, whether it's production, farming, in spaces, say, under the highway bridge, or sort of all mixed up in a market space with selling food and selling building materials and living all in the same spot. There's this really interesting, and this is what I was looking at in Detroit years earlier, there's a really interesting condition of boundaries where they're slippery. They're not parceled out programmatically in a specific way really at all. Yet it works. I mean, there's a kind of messiness to it, there's a chaos to it, but it really works. This is a construction site where they're putting in a new subway, and this footpath is actually one of the most highly touristic areas of the city. It's right near the Opera House, it's right near the hotels, and yet you have to kind of literally not fall into the pit of the subway tunnel because they've just started to push that out. It's like the city is constantly, at the moment, constantly under construction. And some of that will be good, but some of it is going to completely erase that kind of cultural fabric, not to mention the building fabric of the city as it goes. And as architects, we need to be we're part of that development for sure. But I think the way in which we approach that, how we contribute to it or resist it, is for me the question, because there's a kind of sclerotic nature to the city once it gets too finished, and that's the title of the talk, Unfinished Cities. How do we resist that typical momentum of development, which tries to complete the city as a project, that follows a kind of continual agenda of growth, that it's always about growth and getting bigger and getting newer and accumulating more property, where in the end, that actually becomes a city that doesn't allow for much change. In Vietnam at the moment, you see these sorts of, their cell phone numbers and the letters indicate what service they provide, but generally they're concrete demolition services. And so you see these sort of tags stenciled pretty much in any of the older districts that are either slated for development or that people think might be redevelopment. So advertising their own demise on the buildings that that people are living in, which doesn't really go over so well in the neighborhoods. People don't like that, so they try sometimes to wipe them away or to paint over them, but they just keep reappearing. These are sizes of apartments and houses for rent and for sale. So it's interesting, I suppose, at the moment that the city it's such an like kind of unfinished state that it's constantly changing and available like very accessibly, as opposed to it being all complete and finished in a way that is owned by, say, one developer. It's always in flux. Interestingly, I think that sort of tagging has become quite popular. I mean, because it is sort of beautiful. It becomes something that you recognize in Saigon quite frequently, to the point where now it's becoming like the visible face of the city, shown in galleries and put on products. And so you can tell it's reaching, the urban quality is reaching this point where it's romanticizing a kind of demise of the city or transformation of the city, not unlike happened in Detroit. And that's what I think is interesting about Detroit at the moment, is that there's the history of the city and the story of the city, and then there's this long period of time where the city was in a state of crisis, where things like ruin porn became popular, visiting abandoned buildings, looking through rubble. The city was in some ways more popular by tourists than it was by people that could actually do something about it, to the point where now a lot of that is changing, but there's a kind of resistance to changing that story. The story of Detroit is still about its sort of crisis or its death, when in fact that's not really the case anymore. So the narrative gets sort of stuck. This as the city is sort of dying, it's also being reborn, but it's happening at the same time. This is in Ho Chi Minh City, as an example. This District 2 used to have quite a lot of very low, sparse, sort of low-scale development, but it did have people living there and people working there and making and farming there. Now it's going to be the Tutem New Town, which has been advertised, a series of billboards for probably, I mean, I don't know actually how long, but so long as I've been aware of it. This new city under construction directly across the river from the main CBD area that you can see in the background. And these are some of the iconic buildings that are going to be in this new town. So it's, as you can tell, just a very, very different type of development. Not from the world, not globally, not from, say, Melbourne or other cities, but certainly from a Vietnamese urban point of view. There's a kind of erasure of the city and replacement with a different kind of city, which is not unlike what was happening in Detroit 20 years earlier. So the reason I like to look at Vietnam as a case study is because it is in this kind of phase of how they change. It's right at this point where those two sort of cities are coexisting really, really seamlessly. You have the smaller scale development that's in some cases a bit provisional or a bit open, and then the sort of global megacity fabric as well at the same time. And the question I suppose I keep asking is, how do we keep those two things coexisting? Is there a way that we can, not old and new so much as spaces that are accessible, spaces that are controlled by us, and then other areas that are more public or more city or more highly developed? There's a quote, William Gibson was talking about cities, and he was saying that he was describing this situation as cities that are cooked or uncooked, that cities go through a point, all cities go through a point where they have cheap, accessible space for artists, and when they, like London and New York and Paris, but then they reach a point where it's their job actually not to change, and that's where a city becomes cooked. He describes it actually as, which is why I have this photo, he describes it as there's two kinds of cities, one where you can weld on the sidewalk and no one will stop you, and other cities where you can't do that. And Vietnam is, or Ho Chi Minh City in particular, is very much a city where you can still do that, where anything takes place sort of anywhere at the moment. Melbourne is definitely not a city that would allow that, and that's the most livable city. So it's that discrepancy that I've been interested in. And then just, the questions of how do you develop a sort of practice that resists that sort of accumulation. This was a ad you may be familiar with. I saw it in New York a couple of years ago. Manhattan Mini Storage put out a whole series of advertisements for storage spaces in Manhattan, at least a few years ago, that were highly politicized and interestingly, I thought, sort of actually critiquing the same thing they're selling, where they're appealing to people in the city that don't have a lot of space, which is most in the case of Manhattan. But 99, the 99%ers, the people that are in the city that are living in the small spaces, 99% of the people probably use or can afford 1% of the space there. It's not, there's such a gap between what people can afford and how much space you get. So of course you need storage, and that's what they're selling. But I became interested in this because I think space, ownership of space, is one of the key questions of how we can think about cities in this way of resisting a kind of accumulation and singularity of how they develop, especially when you see statistics like this, where 85 of the richest people own as much as 3 billion of the poorest, where 50% of the world's wealth is owned by 1% of the population. And that because that wealth is space. I mean, that wealth is physical space. It's money, but money in capital, money in buildings, money in cities. So you can imagine what, therefore, places like Manhattan Mini Storage are how important that is, because you rely on the rest of the city for the rest of your amenity. It's not all in one space. It's not all within your own control. Space gets distributed and use gets distributed around the rest of the city. So I'm teaching a seminar at the moment at Cranbrook called City Space, where we're looking at this question of space in cities and how much space is enough, how that compares in different countries, how much do we need, how big is a house. To think about, again, the discrepancies between Vietnam and Australia are pretty interesting because they're so extremely different in terms of the average space per person or per household, Australia being even more than the US, believe it or not. And how then that replicates itself in the cities like Melbourne or Sydney in terms of livability. So a really extreme example of that is Antilla in Mumbai, which you may know. It's a single-family house owned by one of the richest business people in India. It's 27 levels. It has 600 staff, and it's a single-family house. So the extreme, where an entire tower becomes owned and occupied by a single family, is like the extreme version of how you could imagine if that were to replicate how incredibly inaccessible cities would become, which is the thing that I've been looking at spatially. So this all gets wrapped up for me in this idea of surviving progress. There's a film called Surviving Progress, which talks about progress traps. This idea that like anything, cities in particular, in my case, can become a victim of their own success, that they do something so well that it starts to undo them. So Detroit is the classic example, with the automobile, building the city entirely around the automobile, a mono economy around the car, and then when that gets so successful, everyone has one, then everyone leaves the city, and it becomes a bit abandoned, as it has been for the past sort of 50 years. And I think Melbourne is not immune to that. There's even, especially, it reaches this point of livability with this backside of unaffordability. The same things that are successful about it are the things that could cause a sort of demise or at some level. And how do you start to predict that? So the question being, instead of looking at, what's broken and we have to fix it, maybe instead we look at what's working too well. What are the things about a city that are working too well? And those perhaps are clues as to when it'll start to flip into a point where it starts to undo questions about livability in particular. So that by way of introduction, to city thinking, my my practice, I guess, has then been looking at different ways of designing projects, whether they be urban scale, building scale, or even small scale interventions in the city that somehow get at this question. And I've been running that also through design studios with students or workshops with students. One, I suppose, category of that work is how do you make in the city? And that's this question about, again, spending time in Detroit and looking at that history. How might we think about manufacturing and the city in the same space, which it used to be, especially early days of making the automobile, for example, Ford Highland plant, which was a vertical factory. There's been more recent re-looking at vertical factories, again, because technology's changed, but that's the whole question, is that technologies have changed, and there's a spatial impact to that. There's from a vertical factory to a big shed, from a downtown site connected to all the other industries and consultants to pushing factories out to the outskirts. There are spatial questions to all of these technological shifts that have to do with how we make things. So the connection between making things and urbanism, for me, has been really one and the same. It wasn't for a long time. I had, in some ways, these two separate practices, one looking at making things and doing a lot of design build work, and the second looking at cities and doing urban workshops. And then it was through practice-based PhD that I did that I started to look at these things as essentially not one and the same, but reciprocal, and that there is a direct relationship between how we make things and how we make cities, and especially the spaces in which we do that. So these different ways of fabrication and how that then has a spatial impact, how it infects our practice as well in terms of building and architectural practice, and how that starts to affect the city. So the fact that now there's such a prevalence of making things and the ease and kind of nimbleness of how we make things that it can be distributed through many different programs in the city, connected to schools, connected to universities, connected to public space. To the point where Melbourne, even this is very recent, Melbourne is now in some ways branding itself on being a factory, as are, say Brooklyn or San Francisco, other cities that are priding themselves on bringing some of this economy back into the city, trying to diversify what the city does when it shifts from, as it has from making things to service industry. Well, that's just as vulnerable as a single economy, so how do we bring making back into the general economy? We looked at that through, one project was called Making Vietnam, where we looked at how making is in fact happening in different places in Vietnam, mapping the different types of manufacturing that were happening in the center city of Ho Chi Minh City, and then around, say, outside of the city in these different rings of the periphery, and how that has a spatial impact. What do those spaces look like? What do those buildings look like? Where is this actually happening? So these are maybe a bit dry, but we basically took a survey of existing building types, looking at residential building types, which varies from, say, the street house or the tube house to a villa, to more rural house types outside the city. We looked at informal types of development, things that just sort of pop up and are provisional and are disappearing within, a week or a month. Industrial building types, there's a common in the dense areas, house factory type, the shed, the big single roof where everything happens underneath it, almost like a market building. So we took these types and then we said, okay, well, how might you think about making things from those types, but in these different sites? So we took essentially a kind of DNA of what the building stock was and then reconfigured it in ways that would satisfy the demand of what couldn't happen in that site. So in other words, in the city, it's quite dense, and so what you can do is have ways of making things that require a lot of space. In the periphery, you have all the space you need, but it's a sort of dismal existence that has no city around it. It's a factory town. There's, you wake up, you go to the factory, you come back. There's no urban quality around it. So how might we think about spaces of making that build in some way off of this DNA of building blocks of the city, but do it in a way that kind of injects into those different sites the thing that it's missing? For example, so one of them we called the wall court, which was taking the single tube house model, and instead of stacking it next to each other, we stacked it in a line. And that would create this kind of buffer, perhaps, between the making spaces and the city. So you still can have that space because it's in close proximity to people working in that area, but it's creating a bit of a buffer between, say, what might be loud and messy and where people are living. The big roof was another type that we used, which is this highly adaptable, shed building. How does that exist in these different sites? What could it promote? What could it offer in a dense site or a peripheral site? And then finally, what we called street teeth was, again, taking the tube house and instead of stacking it next to each other, leaving gaps of space between it so that you could have some porosity between, again, what might be happening in industry on one side and what might be happening in more kind of civic or public realm on the other. So by way of example, we then took those different types and tried them in the different sites. This was the big roof in a very urban site. So it's this idea that, again, it's a malleable, just sort of almost like balloon roof that you could do anything with. In an urban site, it could look perhaps like this, where it becomes a tower and you could have factories or maker spaces and perhaps living spaces within this one giant shell. Or you could take it and do something smaller scale where it becomes elevated as a series of sheds that have some vertical space to them or vertical aspect to them, but are a bit broken up so they're not as dense. They're a little bit separated and the city just flows through them underneath. And then the last one was the more typical shed roof where you have a lot of space, and so it now becomes almost like a market space, but it could accommodate lots of different types of making things in small scales, but in one collective area. And then, so that question too was something that I was doing through a competition and then through design studios called the Future Factory, which was, again, looking at the building type, following from, say, Making Vietnam, where we tested these different types or models of space for making, and how that connects or rejects the city around it. The question here became, what is a factory? What is the building type of a factory, and how could that change? We know the typical building type, but how could that change now that we can think about all these different ways of integrating with the city, as well as different programs that it might attach itself to, like as I mentioned before, schools or public space or even housing. So this was a competition that was run by the Storefront for Art and Architecture a couple years ago, 2 or 3 years ago at least, called the Competition of Competitions. And the question asked, if you could set up as an architect, if you could set up a competition for anything, what do you think we should be looking at? What do you feel like are the pressing questions for architecture now? And so this was a page from that competition entry that I put in with some colleagues of mine, which was saying, okay, what is the future factory? How do we make things? What will they look like? What is their connection to everyday life? What does it mean for the future of cities? That was awarded and exhibited at the Letters to the Mayor exhibition, which you may have seen, which kind of couched this work in a bigger set of questions around, okay, well now we write to the people who can make some sort of change in this, and what would you say? How would you pitch it? So that was the competition bit of it, but then from that, there were a series of teaching projects that I ran with students where they were looking at that same question. And some of these, so Hannah's project, for example, was her Master of Architecture thesis project. Others that I'll show were generally always in the master's program, but they were in a design studio, which we looked at that same question, but the students took it on in a variety of ways. It might be highly speculative, sort of futuristic approaches to what the factory is, or it could have been a specific factory for a specific site, in this case, say, in Melbourne. So Hannah's work was looking at the public nature of making. How could you make a factory that did have a sort of urban quality to it, that it's situated right in this case, in Collingwood, which is a neighborhood very close to the CBD, quite dense. But how would you make that public? How would you make it porous? How would you make it accessible for people not only to use, but to just be part of the fabric around it? And so she had a series of these sort of open spaces. It was very vertical, so you could control a bit what was happening where and how much space you needed for it. But really interested, I suppose, in that question of what that what is the urban connection and how do you promote that? How do you not just put the building there, but program, in a sense, a series of ways that people can use it differently? This was through a Master of Architecture Design studio where they were looking at customization of cars, and that would be, again, back in the city, but quite visible. So the idea that if you make something visible, I mean, partly just by putting it in a city, you will anyway, but this was, you kind of externalize what's happening in the factory so that it becomes almost, sort of spectacular and quite highly visible, so that people will see the processes of the things that see the processes of making the things that we consume. So increasing a sort of awareness of how things are made, bringing that into a more public debate is, like many questions and discussions of environmental concerns, the more aware, the more public these things are, the more you understand how much actually goes into it. These were more, obviously, sort of speculative projects of looking at the entire city making itself as a kind of roaming manufacturing of the city as the city grows, which looks a bit like this. And then Alan's project as a graduate thesis was also looking at the mobility and kind of infrastructure of manufacturing space. So the port typically being the place where everything was made, and then once everything moves out, it gets redeveloped into high-end residential or commercial space. But how might we keep that port as an active port while integrating some sort of manufacturing spaces in it? So then there were some projects that were looking at how do you make from the city? And this was really about byproducts of manufacturing and using materials, reclaiming materials, and using them for different purpose. In particular, I'll just show one. It was a design studio where we worked with Laminex, which was a company in Australia that makes laminate material, and they have like an incredible amount of offcuts and waste material that that just goes to landfill. And so we worked with them. They were interested in how that could be repurposed in some way. It coincided with the London Festival of Architecture, which is has many components, one of which is a student component. So the program we set was to design a piece of urban furniture with laminate material that was flat packable and could be sent to London and installed somewhere on one of the sites in the city that was part of the festival, which we did. So this was one of the projects where they took again, small pieces, because they're often offcuts, drops, and pieces that were not used after the installation of something happened. So these were just a series of not identical, but very similar pieces that would then lock together and create this sort of wall, what they called a wave wall. So it was flat packable in pieces, and then you had to assemble it on site. The other project was looking again at tiny pieces that would be woven together with a kind of elastic material that would create a bus shelter seating area, but more like a leaning wall that you could attach to any bus stop, and it would be signage. It could be signage, or it could be a place for sitting. And then finally, the slice form was a concertina system of just strips of material that could lock together and go from a small single bench to expand out into a bench for, say, 2 or 3 people on site. So we did bring these to, I don't know if I have photos, but we did bring these to London and install them on site, and then we flat packed them, we shipped them, and we sent them back. And they were used. They were pretty well received in that site that we were looking at. And then the second phase of that, we looked at different materials. So these were donations also by local companies. This was Astral Aluminum, where they were, again, trying to figure out what could you do with a small piece of material that is typically what the waste is? How could you make some sort of structural system from that? In this case, we didn't do furniture. We scaled it up to like a pavilion scale or a small space scale, a space for 1 or 2 people. And this was like a little shelter that this group made, and so we made these. We fabricated them in the studio. The second group was looking at wood and how you might reuse the drilled holes from the plywood as fasteners, and again stay within a triangular small piece as a facet for that shelter, which was a sort of rounded shelter that created a bench. So those were again student projects that were more trying to bridge this sort of idea of making and the city by looking at the products of the city. Then finally, at a kind of larger scale, and this is a bit sometimes more abstract work, the question became, how do you make the city? And this for me was, when I was in RMIT, I set up and ran a urban design program that was based in 3 cities in Melbourne, Barcelona, and Ho Chi Minh City. And so the idea here was that you put this question, like I was doing, say, to Melbourne, Detroit, and Ho Chi Minh City, but you put it to these 3 cities. You put one question to each of those and say, well, what can you learn differently in each city about that same question? Whether that's about making or whether it's about something else, there's an idea, I suppose, that at different phases of development, cities can sort of teach each other what is to come or what may have happened. And so it was a very comparative model of thinking about how we design in cities. These were some of the coursework that came out of that, things that we developed as either studios or as elective classes or seminars that were looking at these different questions of mobility in one case, or walkability, hem air, I'll show you in a minute. That was also looking in Ho Chi Minh City at density, post-industry, and high-rise. So we were interested in particular in this question of high-rise. The problem of high-rise and the sort of crisis of high-rise, how do you get over this idea that there's a sort of fear of high-rise and anxiety about it, but there's also a kind of celebration of it. How do you start to think about livability and high-rise? Say in the case of Melbourne, that's all they're building, but there's a lot of anxiety around it because, again, the issue of quality of space and size of space. The desire of people to live outside of the city to have more space, but how do you start to bring some of that amenity in to a high-rise? It's a very, it's a sort of age-old question in a way. But we are looking at it in particular in Vietnam because, again, how do you start to think, the question becomes, how do you start to think about the hem and the tube building in a high-rise environment? It's almost exclusively, a kind of sprawling ground-level development. It's almost incompatible with a high-rise development. So that became the question. How do you think about that unitized quality of urban space, but in an even denser high-rise environment? And these were some of the student projects that came out of that. Thinking about, what's called the hem or the laneway as, again, a kind of network of public spaces, but in a vertical environment. How do you get people up to higher levels? How do you keep that vibrant because it's not happening on the street? Again, common questions of cities for decades, but looking at it in a really particular question or very particular site in Saigon. And so these were some of those student projects. And then finally, this passport project was something that was, it was a collaborative drawing project that I initiated with a series of participants who were located in different parts of the world. And it was a single drawing that happened in a single book, but we mailed the book around to each of the participants in their different cities and asked the question, how would you do a construction document for urbanism? So this question of how do you make the city, I suppose for me at this point was thinking about, well, how do we even draw the city? Like how we draw and document and characterize the city has so much to do with then what it becomes. So the passport was an idea that each person would do essentially like a construction document like we do for buildings, but for the city, and in particular for urbanism. So for the qualities of the city, how do you draw the qualities of LA? How do you draw the qualities of Detroit? But to do it in a way that it, as a city, it could be built by someone else, or it would preference a certain sort of urbanism, it would preference a certain sort of architecture. So I started it in Melbourne, and then the book got sent to each of the other people in their different cities, and it looked something like this. So it was, again, a sort of accordion book that would become one single document at the same time as being individual drawings. And these were some of the ideas that people had. And not everyone was an architect. There were landscape architects and artists, and people that were thinking more about the infrastructure. Some were thinking more about the economy. Some were thinking about what it looked like. This was a drawing I did of Melbourne, looking at the kind of lineaments of the city and the boundaries of the city, and how those may not always follow the physical boundaries of the city, but the more sort of experiential or economic boundaries of the city. This was Istanbul. This is Jonathan Solomon did Hong Kong. Mason was looking at Toronto. Perry Culper, who you would remember from SCI-Arc, looked at Ann Arbor, Pittsburgh, London, and Paris. So that project for me was interesting because it just set out a series of representational questions about the city and how that then, as we think about translations from drawings to building, that sort of idea, how that the drawings that we do could start to influence the quality of urbanism. And now I'm at Cranbrook. So now I'm at head of architecture at Cranbrook, which is a small program. And it's really a research-based program. There's not coursework per se. It's an independently driven sort of design thesis that students come in with their own ideas of what they want to pursue, and we develop a kind of framework for that work independently, but among all of the peers in our group in architecture. As an academy, it's an art academy, so there's 10 other programs that are MFA degrees, and we participate quite closely with them as well. So we have students from, say, fibers or metals or sculpture that are in architecture in an elective format, and then our students can take electives in the other departments. So it definitely has this kind of open question about practice, and that's what I've been really interested in developing through Cranbrook, is how the work we do in, say, the 2 years of the master's program is the seed for a kind of innovative approach to practice, there's not a kind of separation between what you're doing in school and what you're practicing, but how that has a kind of legacy for what people do when they get out. And often, that's actually why people, I think, are attracted to Cranbrook, because it's an opportunity to either come back into an academy or an educational environment and really pursue something sort of deeply, or they want to think about their own work in a different way and perhaps do a more interdisciplinary kind of practice when they get out. It's a really amazing campus that has actually K through 12 schools on it, as well as then the academy. So there's also this kind of really interesting educational legacy to thinking about the connections between vertical connections of education as well as interdisciplinary questions of what we do as makers. And we have this big space, as you do, actually. It's like in our case, it's 6,000 square feet with a wood shop and a digital fabrication shop attached to it, and then my studio attached to it. So it's very much a space of experimentation and making. And I think in our case, building the culture of the program is going to be really important, thinking about the way we use the space, the way we make things. And in particular, these same questions for me about practice, how we think about practice differently in a context of the city, how we think about the city and what it is, and then making as the space between that, how we make things that affect both practice and the future of cities, in particular Detroit. I think Detroit, it's about 20 minutes away from where Cranbrook is, so there's quite a lot of overlap between what we'll be doing and what questions are being asked about the cities in Detroit at the moment. So that's it. I think that's my last slide. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for coming.